December 21st, 1944. It was 6:12 a.m. The air over Malmedy, Belgium, bit like broken glass. Each breath turned to vapor, hanging in the dim blue pre-dawn light. Snow lay on ruins, shattered brick, broken factory windows, iron girders warped by shell fire. The war had turned everything familiar into a jagged hush. Inside the skeleton of an abandoned coal-processing works, a 19-year-old American named Francis Sherman Curry crouched beside a blown-out doorway. In his frost-numbed hands, he gripped a single-shot bazooka. Borrowed, unproven, possibly defective. Slung across his back, a .30-caliber machine gun clattered against his kit with every motion. His position was utterly exposed. Barely 30 yards from a narrow bridge the Germans were expected to cross. No sandbags, no shelter, no reinforcements, only rubble and a last-minute plan. Curry was no hero at that moment. He was terrified, freezing, and alone. The other American anti-tank teams had been destroyed or driven back. German Panzers, thick-skinned steel beasts, were rolling toward him. If they crossed that span, the wounded men behind him would be trapped, and the enemy would blast straight through the Allied line. Francis Curry could have fled. Instead, he stayed. He emplaced his bazooka at what any officer would call a suicidal angle, too close to fire safely, too exposed to survive, with no easy escape. He waited for no orders. He expected not to walk away. And somehow, for the next 3 hours, one 19-year-old gunner held the line. Background and character. Francis Sherman Curry was born June 29, 1925, in Loch Sheldrake, a small town in upstate New York. He lost his father at 12. Raised by his mother and grandmother, he was the sort of boy who vanished into the woods to build tree forts and tinker with anything that had gears. He was neither scholar nor brawler. When he tried to enlist at 17, the Army turned him away as too young. He waited, and the moment he turned 18, he signed up. Trained as an infantryman, in early 1944 he shipped to Europe with the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory. By December, Curry had seen fighting in France, the Netherlands, and Germany. He had lost friends. He had fired his rifle in fear, in anger, and in sorrow. But nothing prepared him for the frozen thickets of the Ardennes. Hitler's counteroffensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, was a last, desperate gamble. More than 200,000 German troops surged through the Ardennes under snow and fog, aiming to split the Allies and seize the port of Antwerp. The American troops there were exhausted, short of equipment, and not braced for a major blow. Curry's unit, Company K of the 120th Infantry Regiment, was posted near Malmedy. Their orders were simple: hold the line and guard the road network leading into Allied rear areas. What none of them knew was that elite panzer divisions, including battle-hardened SS tank crews, were advancing with orders to punch through before Christmas. In the first chaotic hours, anti-tank guns were knocked out, communications severed, units scattered and forced to withdraw. But Curry stayed. He and a handful of comrades occupied a weak defensive pocket in and around the ruined works beside a vital bridge. The Germans approached. The road was exposed. There was no time to wait for help. As the snow kept falling, Francis Curry made a choice that would alter his life and the fate of those behind him. First assault. At 6:28 a.m., the silence shattered. It began with the low metallic grind of tracks, the unmistakable approach of German armor, then the crunch of boots on ice, muffled German commands, and the thudding tremor that only a tank column can make. Curry crawled to the edge of the blown doorway. What he saw confirmed his worst dread. A column of German infantry, supported by tanks, advancing down the narrow lane toward the bridge. The lead vehicle was a Panzer Mark V, its turret sweeping left and right like a stalking predator. There was no time to deliberate, only time to move. Behind him, 5 wounded Americans lay trapped beneath the collapsed wall from the earlier barrage. They could not get up. They could not run. If the German column crossed the bridge, it would steamroll them. A frontal stand against a tank force with a lone bazooka was suicide. But there was one slim chance, not to meet them head-on, but to strike from an angle just before they funneled onto the bridge, where the lead tank would slow and expose weaker side armor. It was not defensible. It offered no cover and no route of retreat. It was the only clear shot. Dragging the heavy launcher and a single rocket across the icy floor, Curry shifted behind a collapsed beam near the roadside. He had 10 seconds, maybe less, before the lead Panzer closed. His breath fogged on the steel of the tube as he steadied the sights. His gloves were torn, fingertips numb. He could barely feel the trigger. Then the tank appeared. It crawled into view less than 30 yards away. The sound was overwhelming. Curry aimed directly at the turret's base. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket roared forward, trailing smoke and sparks, and slammed into the Panzer's flank with a deafening explosion. The turret jerked, then stopped. Fire erupted from the side armor. German voices screamed in confusion. Curry didn't wait. He dropped the bazooka and sprinted back toward the building. Zigzagging through debris as machine gun fire erupted behind him. Bullets kicked up slivers of ice and brick all around him. Inside, he grabbed a Browning automatic rifle and fired through the Facto's broken windows, cutting down German infantry as they scrambled for cover. Then, switching to a .30 caliber machine gun mounted on Adamaged Jeep outside, he sprayed suppressing fire across the road, keeping the remaining German troops from flanking. But the Germans regrouped quickly. A second Panzer rolled forward, angling toward the factory. Curry knew he didn't have time to reload the bazooka. So instead, he crawled through a hole in the wall, slid across frozen mud to a position even closer to the road, and retrieved another rocket from a fallen comrade's pack. He jammed it into the launcher, set up behind a low pile of rubble, and waited. The tank approached, slower this time, more cautious, but unaware of his exact position. Curry's heart pounded in his ears. He took a deep breath, held it, and fired again. Another direct hit. The second Panzer shuddered and began to burn. Now the Germans panicked. Without proper intelligence on American numbers, they believed they were under attack by a larger anti-tank force. Their column halted. Infantry ducked for cover. A third tank reversed down the road to avoid becoming the next target. For the moment, the advance had stalled, but Curry wasn't finished. He crawled back into the factory where the wounded Americans were still trapped beneath rubble. Despite the risk, Curry used a metal beam to pry up the fallen masonry. One by one, he dragged his injured comrades to cover, shielding them with debris and discarded doors. He gave them water from his canteen, checked their pulses, whispered that help would come. Above them, German mortars started to fall. The factory shook. Chunks of concrete rained down, but Curry stayed with them. Then, over the groan of engines, came a sound that made his stomach turn. The unmistakable whine of tank treads repositioning. A fourth Panzer was moving into place, attempting to flank the factory from the north side. Curry looked around. No more bazooka rockets, no anti-tank grenades, no reinforcements. He had only one option. Outside, near the bridge, lay a destroyed American half-track vehicle, abandoned during the earlier fighting. Mounted on it was a Browning .50 caliber machine gun. If it still worked, it could cut through infantry and damage even lightly armored tanks. But it was completely exposed. To get there, Curry would have to run straight into open ground in full view of the enemy. It was madness, but Curry didn't hesitate. He slung his rifle, took one last look at the men he had saved, and whispered to himself, "Let's finish this." Then he ran into the fire. 3 hours of hell. Francis Curry sprinted through a nightmare. The frozen ground cracked beneath his boots. Bullets snapped past him, punching holes in metal, tearing through steam vents, ricocheting off debris. Behind him, mortar blasts sent geysers of earth and ice skyward, raining down shrapnel that hissed through the air like hornets. He didn't stop. The burned-out American half-track stood near the bridge, a wreck of twisted steel, scorched paint, and shattered glass. Its side armor had buckled from a direct hit, but the .50 caliber machine gun on its roof mount remained barely. Curry hauled himself onto the mangled chassis, the metal searing his palms through torn gloves. The moment his head rose above the hull, German infantry spotted him. A dozen rifles opened fire. He ducked, yanked the bolt of the Browning .50 cal, and prayed it wasn't jammed. It wasn't. And prayed it wasn't jammed. It wasn't. The weapon roared to life, thunderous and savage, drowning out the war around him. The barrel pulsed with fire as he swept it across the road, carving through advancing German infantry. Soldiers fell, vehicles reversed. A third Panzer, attempting to flank, slammed its brakes and veered off course, its crew abandoning it under withering fire. Curry had no cover. Every round fired in his direction sent sparks dancing across the half-track's ruined frame. The gun heated fast, steaming in the snow, but he kept firing. Every fifth round, a tracer, red-hot streaks tearing through fog, cutting lines across the battlefield. He was no longer a target. He was the center of gravity. For the next 20 minutes, Curry held that gun, sweeping left, then right, forcing the entire German column to stall. The bridge behind him remained untouched. The 5 wounded Americans in the factory were still alive. Not one Panzer crossed. Then the gun overheated. Smoke curled from the barrel. The mount jammed. Curry kicked the release lever, dropped from the half-track, and ran. He ducked into a frozen ditch, breathing hard, blood trickling from a cut on his neck. The smell of burning oil filled his lungs. In the distance, German officers barked commands. Curry heard tracks moving again. Another tank repositioning. They were grouping, resetting, preparing to push again. His legs ached. His fingers were numb. His helmet was gone. But he refused to break. Over the next 2 hours, Curry fought like a ghost in a machine. He moved between collapsed buildings, ducking into basement, using broken doors for cover. He scavenged ammunition from the dead. He found an M1 Garand rifle and used it to pick off advancing soldiers from upper windows. He hurled grenades at supply trucks. He shot out the tires of a Kubal wagon as it attempted to flank. 1 hour in, helicated another rocket, just one inside a knocked-out Jeep. He dragged it back to the factory, mounted it into the same bazooka he had used earlier, and waited. Another Panzer appeared, this one crawling forward more cautiously, its turret scanning windows. Curry waited until it turned, exposing its side again. Then he fired. The rocket struck clean. Smoke, flame, a metallic groan. The crew bailed, some on fire, some crawling. Curry aimed his Garand and shot one of the fleeing officers in the leg, sending him sprawling into the snow. At that moment, the Germans realized the truth. There was no unit holding this factory, no battalion, no full anti-tank team, just one man. And yet they still couldn't break through. By now, his uniform was shredded, one sleeve torn. Blood soaked his left leg from a graze he hadn't noticed. His hands were burned from gripping overheated barrels. His voice was hoarse from shouting over explosions. But still he fought. One of the most surreal moments came when he paused behind a wall and looked up and saw a German soldier no more than 15 FT away, equally exhausted, equally frozen, clutching his rifle, but not raising it. They stared at each other for 1 second. 2, then both turned and ran in opposite directions. War had momentarily broken under the weight of exhaustion. At approximately 9:15 in the morning, the Germans launched one last push. 3 tanks in a staggered formation, infantry fanning out to either side, covering fire raining down from their rear. Curry had nothing left but his Garand and a few magazines. He crawled to a second-floor window and opened fire, targeting the tank commanders who had their hatches open. He struck one in the shoulder. The man tumbled from the turret. The tank halted. A moment later, American artillery began falling, distant thumps signaling their turn of heavy support. Curry had held the line just long enough. The German advance staggered. Officers pulled troops back to regroup. A 5th Panzer reversed direction and retreated down the road. Infantry scattered into the trees. By 9:30, the road was clear. Curry limped back to the factory. His hands shook as he reached the doorway. The 5 wounded men were still there, barely conscious, but alive. Hess sat beside them. Snow fell through a hole in the roof. For the first time in 3 hours, no one was firing. They had survived because one 19-year-old gunner had made a choice that morning to stay, to fight, and to stand alone. Turning the tide. When the smoke began to clear, Francis Curry didn't feel like a hero. He felt like he was dying. His body throbbed with pain in his leg, his arms, his jaw. He had not slept in 36 hours. He hadn't eaten in nearly a day. The cold was biting harder than ever now that the adrenaline was wearing off, but the road was silent. For the first time that morning, no tanks growled. No boots thundered on stone. No mortars fell, only the soft hiss of snow landing on scorched metal. Curry looked out toward the bridge. It was still intact, unoccupied, unbroken, and, more importantly, unreached. Behind him, the 5 wounded Americans she had shielded were alive. One had a shattered femur. Another was missing part of his hand, but all of them would make it out. And most of all, so would the division. Curry's actions had prevented an armored breakthrough at a critical choke point near Malmedy. German panzers had been ordered to seize the bridge and advance westward, cutting off supply lines and encircling American forces trapped in the Bulge. His resistance had delayed them long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the rear. According to post-battle reports, the German column that attacked Curry's position was forced to divert south, where it was later pinned down and destroyed by American artillery and air power. The time Curry bought those 3 agonizing hours helped collapse one of the last aggressive pushes of Hitler's winter offensive. He did not know that, of course, not yet. At that moment, all he knew was that they were alive. He collapsed beside the others, too tired to speak. For a few minutes, they just sat there, leaning on each other, shaking from the cold, the fear, and the incredible weight of survival. The incredible weight of survival. When an American patrol finally reached the area, they found Curry on his feet, rifle slung low, face streaked with dirt and dried blood, giving water to one of the wounded men. The officer in charge asked, "Who's in command here?" Curry answered simply, "I don't know. I was just trying to keep them alive." That humility would become a hallmark of his legacy. Later, officers would piece together these sequence of events: the destroyed tanks, the recovered rocket launcher, the German retreat. Eyewitnesses confirmed the scale of what Curry had done, taking out multiple enemy vehicles, rescuing wounded under fire, holding the bridge alone. But Francis Curry never spoke of it in dramatic terms. To him, it had just been what the moment demanded. The men he saved would go on to recover and rejoin their families. That patch of road, just a few hundred FT of frozen Belgian stone, would remain in Allied hands for the rest of the war. Curry's stand hadn't just saved lives. It had stopped the enemy cold in every sense of the word, and it had proven something far bigger. That in the chaos of war, with nothing left but instinct, grit, and resolve, one 19-year-old American kid with a borrowed bazooka could hold off a panzer advance and win the echo of heroism. Word of Curry's actions traveled fast. In the hours following the engagement, his superiors compiled field reports and witnessed testimonies from the few surviving soldiers who had seen what happened. The wreckage of the battlefield spoke for itself. Multiple disabled German tanks, scattered weapons, scorched armor, and the unlikely survival of 5 wounded men in a position that should have been overrun. Commanding officers quickly realized they were dealing with an act of extraordinary bravery, one that stood out even amid the chaos of the Ardennes. A formal citation was written documenting every verifiable detail that Curry had used a bazooka to destroy at least one enemy tank, fired a Browning automatic rifle and a 50 caliber machine gun 8 exposed positions under direct fire, rescued 5 wounded comrades, and single-handedly disrupted an enemy armored assault. Less than 6 months later, on July 27, 1945, President Harry S. Truman awarded Francis Sherman Curry the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest decoration. The official Medal of Honor citation reads in part, "Sergeant Curry's conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, are in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, the 30th Infantry Division, and the United States Army." Curry was just 20 years old. He returned to the United States not with a hero's swagger, but with the quiet bearing of someone who had done what needed to be done and never expected a reward for it. In interviews, when asked about that day, he was reluctant to glorify his actions. Yancey said plainly, "I just did what had to be done." After the war, Curry settled back in New York. He worked for many years at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Albany, dedicating his life to helping other servicemen readjust and heal. He stayed out of the spotlight, declining many of the honors and parades that others might have embraced. And yet, his story endured. In 2009, his hometown honored him by naming the local post office in Hurleyville the Francis S. Curry Post Office. A statue of him was later erected in Casanova Park in Buffalo, depicting the moment he fired his bazooka under fire. A tribute cast in bronze to the courage of a 19-year-old who held the line. Curry remained one of the youngest Medal of Honor recipients from World War II and among the last living by the early 2000s. He passed away on October 8, 2019, at the age of 94. To the end, he carried himself not as a legend, but as a veteran, as someone who understood the true cost of war, not in medals or monuments, but in the names of the friends who didn't make it home, humility and legacy. After the war, Francis Curry could have taken a victory lap. He could have toured the country, given speeches, written a book. He could have made a name for himself, cashed in on his medal, and lived in the glow of national attention. But he didn't. Instead, he returned to the quiet towns of New York, first Hurleyville, then South Bethlehem, and lived the kind of life that doesn't make headlines, but shapes communities. He worked for the Veterans Affairs Department for more than 30 years, helping fellow soldiers navigate the maze of post-war benefits, rehabilitation, and recovery. He did not speak much about the war, not because he was hiding from it, but because he believed his role was to serve, not to shine. People who knew him remember a soft-spoken man who carried his Medal of Honor in a drawer, not on his chest. A man who never referred to himself as a hero. A man who could smile at a child, help an old veteran, fill out paperwork, and speak plainly about life and death, and what it meant to stand for something when it really counted. His humility was his strength. In a time when celebrity often overshadows service, Curry's life reminds us of a different kind of greatness, one rooted in quiet action, not public praise. His heroism was not a brand. It was a decision made in freezing mud under enemy fire for reasons that had nothing to do with recognition. There's something profoundly American about that. His story has been used in classrooms, militaries, and leadership courses to illustrate not just courage, but integrity, the kind that endures after the headlines fade. To students, he became more than a figure in a textbook. He became a symbol of responsibility, of the choice to act when no one else will. And there's a deeper lesson here. Francis Curry didn't win a battle by being the strongest, fastest, or most heavily armed. He won by being prepared, by staying calm in crisis, and by never losing sight of who he was fighting for. Not for glory, not for revenge, but for the men beside him. In a world hungry for role models, Curry gives us one grounded in substance. He shows us that leadership does not always say, "Look like command." Sometimes it looks like crawling through debris to pull someone else to safety. Sometimes it looks like standing your ground with no promise of success, simply because it's right. And sometimes it looks like a 19-year-old kid refusing to run when running would have been the easiest choice in the world. In his later years, when asked about that day in Belgium, Curry offered no sweeping speeches, no dramatics. He said, "I just did what had to be done." And maybe that's the legacy, because within that single line lies the essence of everything he stood for. Duty without pride, bravery without recognition, and the understanding that history isn't written by those chasing remembrance, but by those who, in their hardest hour, choose to do what must be done. What would you choose? We live in an age of comfort, distraction, and endless choices. Most of us will never endure what Francis Curry faced that cold December morning in 1944. Most will never stand alone in the path of tanks, with wounded comrades behind and enemy fire ahead, forced to decide in mere seconds what kind of person we truly are. Yet his story leaves a question that lingers far beyond the war front. What do you do when no one gives you orders? When escape feels easier? When every instinct begs you to run, but the moment insists you stay? Francis Curry didn't stop a Panzer advance because he was the most skilled soldier in the field. He didn't hold the line because he lacked fear. He stood firm because he chose to. And that choice is what endures. We all face moments, maybe not with weapons and explosions, but with duties and dilemmas. When no one's watching, when there's no guidance, no praise, and no certainty. Times when someone must act, and that someone is you. Curry's suicidal angle wasn't just a tactic on a battlefield. It symbolized every impossible decision that still demands to be made. That's what gives his story strength, not the size of his act, but the purity of his reason. He saw 5 wounded men behind him, tanks advancing before him, and decided, no one else is coming. I'll stay. We like to picture courage as loud, fiery, cinematic, but sometimes it's quiet. A 19-year-old kneeling in the snow, clutching a battered bazooka, knowing he likely won't live another 5 minutes, and still choosing to fight. That's courage. That's conviction. And that's why this story matters, not only to historians of war, but to anyone who wonders how much one person can truly change. So now the question becomes yours. If you stood in that factory with 5 lives depending on you, facing certain death ahead, would you stay? Would you fight? Would you take the impossible angle? What struck you most? What would you have done in Francis Curry's place? Tell us below, because sometimes the quietest tales carry the loudest truths, and sometimes the smallest choices, the ones no one witnesses, are the ones that define us forever.